Hi, welcome to Stained Glass class. Today we're going to be talking about solder and soldering equipment. Solder is basically made out of lead and tin. So we have different types of solder. We have 50-50 solder, which is of course half tin and half lead. We have 60-40 solder, 60% tin, 40% lead. 63-37, seems like a very small difference, but there is a main difference which we'll talk about. So 63% tin, 37% lead, and then there's lead-free solder. So first of all, starting with the 50-50, we will use 50-50 solder to fill in any gaps that we have in our pieces. No matter how careful we are, there's always going to be some space between the pieces of glass. 50-50 is excellent for filling in those spaces. And also, if you're just going to be tacking the whole thing together so your pieces don't move around, 50-50 is excellent for that. Moving on to 60-40. 60-40 solder is a better choice than 50-50 for beading your solder. So in other words, what we're trying to accomplish is a round seam. We shouldn't be able to feel the foil. The foil is really only on the project so that the solder has a surface to adhere to. You can't just solder over the glass itself. You need to have something to adhere to. So copper is an inexpensive material. It bends easily and it accepts solder well. So what we want to do is we want to make a round seam on top of the copper foil. So 60-40 is going to flow better. Now since 50-50 melts at a slightly higher temperature than 60-40, it is a bit of a barrier so that the solder won't melt through to the other side. So it's also a little less expensive. So if we use 50-50 for that first process, it's saving us a little bit of money and making a barrier so that the next solder won't melt through. So 60-40 solder is probably the standard for most stained glass artists. Because it melts at a slightly lower temperature than the 50-50, it won't melt through as quickly. It stays liquid for a little longer so that you can work smoothly with it. It's not setting up too fast. It gives you a chance to try and get a fairly smooth solder seam. So I would highly recommend 60-40 as your norm, something you'll use for pretty well everything except that first step of filling in the spaces. When you're first learning stained glass, 63-37 can be a real bonus for you because it is very slightly, it sets up a little bit faster than 60-40 does. So you have less ripples in your piece, and it's also a little more forgiving. Because it is hardening faster, you tend to get a little smoother solder seam than you would with the 60-40. Very subtle, not a huge difference, but I found that a lot of people find that it's a good thing to start with, and then once you find that you're moving along quite quickly, the 60-40 seems to be a little better choice. The 63-37 also is very helpful if you're doing decorative soldering, and that's something that we'll perhaps talk about in a different video. But basically, decorative soldering is when you take a nice smooth seam and then you do things to decorate it or to make it a little more attractive. So since 63-37 sets up fairly quickly, it's a really good choice for doing decorative soldering. And the last choice is lead-free solder. Lead-free solder is an excellent idea if you're going to be making jewelry that'll be touching people's skin all the time. It's also really good if you're going to make something to go into a child's bedroom. If you're making a nightlight, for example, then the lead-free solder is certainly worth considering. It's not a good choice for general purpose soldering because you need a lot more heat. You'll find yourself needing a 900-degree tip in most cases to do a decent job of using the lead-free solder, pardon me. And it also tends to set up really quickly, so it's very difficult to get a nice solder seam with the lead-free solder. From my personal experience, I'm sure there's some people that have worked ways out of doing that, but we also found because we're heating the glass up to such a high temperature, we're getting a lot more cracks with it. So generally speaking, I would recommend that you use 50-50, 60-40, or 63-37, depending on what you're actually hoping to accomplish with your soldering. So once we've decided what we want to use for solder, we have to get a good soldering iron. And generally speaking, working in stained glass, you're going to use anywhere from a 60 to 100 watt soldering iron. Different manufacturers, their wattages will provide different amounts of heat. The one that we use and we recommend these days is made by Hako. They're made in Japan, and they're very good quality irons. They're made out of good quality materials. They're well engineered, and you can get different tips for them. Basically, we have a gnarled nut here which we can undo and take it out and put in a different tip if we want to get a smaller or a wider tip. And we also use a rheostat with this iron. So with the rheostat, we can have everything from full, which is generally what I use. We can turn it down if we want less heat. Especially when you're starting off, often you'll find that the solder is melting through on you because you're perhaps taking a little more time than you should, moving a little slower than someone who has had more experience with. So it's nice to be able to turn your temperature on your iron down a little bit so that that's not an issue. Also, if you're working with lead will melt a little faster sometimes than solder does. So if you're not careful, you can very easily melt the lead, especially if you're making Christmas angels as an example with very thin hobby lead. So again, you can turn it down a little further for those types of situations. It also helps to keep it at a little more of an even temperature so that you know that it's not going to heat up past a certain point. When you start off and you're moving fairly slow, that's a real benefit. As you start to move faster and it becomes less of a benefit, if you're sitting on full all the time, for example, you might find that it's better in those cases just to unplug it and go directly into the wall. If you're moving along quickly, you'll find that this iron will provide you with enough heat, and you don't really need the rheostat to keep things cooler. It's very important to have a soldering iron stand. I don't think I can overemphasize that for two reasons. Number one, for safety for your home. As much as everybody tries their best to make sure they've unplugged their iron when they go to bed, I've heard many, many instances where people have left their soldering on overnight, soldering iron plugged in overnight, and if that is going to come into contact with any kind of a combustible, of course that's going to be a major issue. And second of all, every once in a while when you're tired or just not watching what you're doing, you bring your hand over, you might just grab the soldering iron by the wrong end, and that is not a happy day. So I would highly recommend for the small investment that the soldering iron stand is an excellent choice to invest in. Stands also have a spot for a sponge. When we're using the soldering iron, it's important to be able to wipe off any dross. Dross is the impurities in the solder which build up on the soldering iron. So using a wet sponge, we can clean off that dross very easily. And also when soldering, I find it is really critical to have a good fume extracting system. And not everybody's going to want to put a hole in their wall and have a fairly sophisticated system that's blowing everything right out of the house. So what this does, this is also made by Hacko, and it has a carbon filter system which will take the solder fumes, the flux fumes. You can see this is one that we use ourselves in our day-to-day practice quite frequently. You can see how much stuff is stuck on there. If it's not going through the filter, it's probably going to end, a certain amount of it's going to end up in your lungs. So it's very important to have some kind of a filtering system. So this is a very sophisticated system. It'll go through this sponge, through a carbon filter, and then the clean air is exited out the back. This is a very light tool, and I find that the most effective way to use it is to actually put it right on top of, right beside and or on top of your piece, and it'll draw through these two slots very strongly. And then of course the clean air is coming out in this direction. It can also be used standing up, so if you're doing more of a three-dimensional piece, you can get more of a draw a few inches off of the table surface. This front sponge can be cleaned off. You just have to take it to the sink and wash it off, and the carbon filters can be changed as required. So I think that'll give you a really good idea of the different types of solder that are available, when they should be used, and also a good idea of the soldering equipment that is used to solder in stained glass. And in a future video, we're going to talk about the soldering process and give you an idea of how that works.